and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we're here on the Dark Matter Digital Network. Our show lasts for a couple of hours, and I want to thank everyone that supports the show. You can listen to the whole show for $1 a month or more, or you can listen to the whole show live, or you can listen to the first hour as a podcast for free. And I want to thank supporters out there. A couple of people I want to shout out to. One is LOL Infected. I'm sorry, that's the only name I have for him. And another guy gave me his full name to use. That's Greg Galen. I want to thank him. Peter N., thank you. And there's many, many more. We have T-shirts that are the graphics are being made down in New York City, and hopefully they'll be done soon. And new T-shirts will come out. Everyone more or less did not like the old ones, so I'll be giving those away as we go along. And tonight's guest, I forgot to mention, we have Alejandro Rojas coming right up with the news in just a minute. But tonight's guest is Nick Redfern. We're going to talk about all different types of subjects. First of all, he's got a book, The Rh negative factor in blood, that is talked about in so many experiencers' cases, and is very interesting. There's really a connection there. So his new book is called Bloodline of the Gods, Unravel the Mystery in the Human Blood Type to Reveal the Aliens Among Us. Now, Nick, as you know, most people out there know, is a very prolific writer. He has 3 books out now. We're going to touch on a couple of them. In the second hour, we're going to be talking about his book, Men in Black. I think that's interesting, and a couple of other books he's done. And so that'll be coming up in a little bit. And now we have Alejandro Rojas with the news. How are you, Alejandro?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
Good. You were under the weather. You're doing better. So I'm
glad.
glad.
I had bad tummy, but I have better tummy.
Good.
Not completely healed tummy, but better.
Good. Glad to have you
reminded me of some exciting news.
Good.
That is that Nick Redfern's going to be speaking at the next UFO Congress.
All right. I get to meet him. Good.
Yeah. So last week I posted at least around half of our speakers that'll be there. An exciting list, and Nick Redfern is among them. So I'm real excited about that.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, pretty cool. Lots of really interesting stuff. And other news, last week I touched on that Puerto Rico thing, and I don't want to talk about it too much here because we already did. But I did want to add this interesting development, which is that we have heard from a couple of experts who work on those systems or are very familiar with those thermal imaging systems. In one case, the gentleman I had been going back and forth with worked on these things for thousands of hours. He's like a very high-level maintenance person with them, as high level as you can get. And he agrees with the analysis. He says that what is seen in this Puerto Rican UFO FLIR image is not a balloon, and it's nothing he's ever seen before. And his argument for it not being a balloon especially is that it's too hot. That, it's very dark in the image, which means it's a hot object, and it's way too hot, especially if you compare it to the heat signatures that you can see of the vehicles and planes that you can see in the background of this thing, that it's way too hot to be a balloon. So he doesn't think it could be that. And
that's great.
Yeah, so he agrees with the analysis, and he says it's one of the strangest things he's ever seen. He and his people around the office have been passing it around, and they're all pretty taken aback by it. So, yeah, some pretty positive stuff regarding that. Really interesting.
And you have your show this week is an interview with the people that have been researching this as well.
Yeah, normally that would have gone up on Monday. But I was sick the last couple of days in bed, rolling around in bed with fever and yuckiness. Yeah. But that is going up. That's gone up today. So I have an interview with the two of the researchers, Robert Powell and Morgan Bial, and we talk more about this. And they give a lot of interesting background that people don't know yet, which is a large part of all of this that I think people are going to find terribly interesting.
Great. So what else is happening?
What else is happening? Well, this is kind of a funny story, and I got lucky, and as I will sometimes when I'm looking for stories. This is a story written by Roger Marsh, MUFON's director of communication, but he also writes for us, and it's a story about bears. But what's funny about this, it's gotten the news, bears and UFOs, and it just looks like the media decided to pick up on the UFO thing because it's popular, and they said, study finds bears react to UFOs overhead. So it really isn't bears reacting to UFOs, but it is bears reacting to drones. So they wanted to know how much of a disturbance drones and things are to bears, and if they would even notice, because bears seem to not really pay attention to bugs and stuff like that.
Why bears, though? I mean, there's thousands of different animals in the forest. Why are they picking out bears to test this on?
Maybe because they're big predators that really don't have a predator that that they fear, just to see how they would react. But they just noticed that they have a physiological response to UFOs. And, of course, the drone to them would be a UFO because they don't know what the hell that thing is flying around above them. But it's kind of a funny story. And I say I got lucky with the picture because I found this picture, and it's a real picture from this guy in Canada who was taking pictures, wildlife pictures, and a bear came up. So he ran into his car, and the bear, but he left his camera on the tripod with the zoom lens and everything, and the bear came up to his camera and stood up and looked into his camera. So it looks like this bear is looking through this camera. It's a really funny picture. It's a cool picture. But interesting enough, it's not too UFO related, but people just must love the fuzzy bears. So actually that story did pretty well. Lots of people were looking at that because it's kind of fun. But more down to business.
Okay.
UFO businesses. Roger also wrote something about a MUFON report that came in. And this is 3 triangular UFOs that were allegedly seen by a family in Alabama. So this guy says it was about 7 p.m. on August 10th when he was sitting out in the backyard, and he was looking up and he sees a passenger jet. He estimated to be 27 to 30,000 feet high. And but then out of the peripheral of his eyes, he said he saw another object flying behind it that seemed to be following it. He looked more closely, and he said it looked to be like a triangular object without wings. He was so floored by this, he called his wife and had her come out to take a look too, and they were pretty shocked by the whole thing. They then talked to their son and told him about it, and he said, well, look towards my house in this direction because there's a couple more. And they said they did, and sure enough, they saw 2 more. So they say they saw 3 triangular-shaped UFOs.
Wow.
So, yeah, and this one of the witnesses, his background is he's worked with the Army and the military. He's had top secret clearances before, and he's worked on a number of different top secret type of defense projects and things. So he's a credible person. So it doesn't seem to be a hoax, and he feels he saw, 3 triangular UFOs.
Now, what is your opinion on that in the connection to military? Do you think there's possibly something out there the military has that they're... I mean, I go back and forth on it because I don't understand why they would fly in populated areas if they are testing something, but I don't know. There's so many triangle UFO sightings, it seems.
Well, that's the hard part, I think. I think we do and we don't. For instance, in the last couple of years, there have been some photographs taken of triangular-shaped aircraft that have contrails, and they don't appear to be stealth bombers or anything that we know of. So they appear to be testing of some sort of triangular-shaped plane. Now, these have contrails, which is, indicative of more conventional sort of propulsion systems. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the TR-3B, I felt that, and David Marler, who is now, I feel, an authority on triangular aircraft, he doesn't believe that exists. There's this legend of a TR-3B, anti-gravity triangular craft, and I've looked into this as well, and there is no evidence, just rumors. There was I think it was a TR-3A, which was a prototype. I don't even think they built it, but it was a stealth technology demonstrator type of thing. It was a concept sort of thing, but that's it. But nothing beyond that. So we don't have anything beyond that. There's, of course, the Aurora out there. There's a lot of people that feel the Aurora is real, and there are references to something called the Aurora, which is some sort of next step, craft. And then there are other, Popular Mechanics has written a lot about other possible past the SR-71, super stealthy, fast craft that can even break orbit that are, triangular shaped. So I'm sure the military and the private sector are working on, top secret triangular aircraft. But there's still a genuine mystery here because, if you look at David Marler's book, he has cases going back to the 1800s of triangular shaped craft. So yeah, it's really hard to say.
Yeah, there was a triangle sighting right over my house recently, which
really,
yes, I didn't see it, and I don't have the person's permission to talk about it really, but she drew me a picture of it and said, "What do you suppose this could be?" She said the lights didn't blink at all; they just stayed on, and
wow.
it was a perfect triangle with 5 lights. So I don't know. I started going out at night to see if I could see it again or whatever, But anyway, all interesting. Well, that's probably it. And I'm glad you're feeling better. Welcome back. And thanks so much for the news today.
All right. Thank you, man. Thanks for having me on again. And we'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you next week. And I will actually be at the Experiencer Speak coming up next weekend on the 28th and 29th. And I'm going to play this little commercial, and right after that will be a music break, and Nick Redfern will be coming right up. Hang in.
Starborn Support presents the 4th Annual Experiencer Speak Conference, a UFO conference focused on the abductee experience phenomenon, featuring well-known speakers in the field. August 28th and 29th at Fireside Inn & Suites, Portland. There is no other conference just for and about experiencers. What you hear and see will leave you speechless. To register and find out more info, visit experiencerspeak.yolasite.com. Experiencer Speak Conference, Friday, August 28th and Saturday, August 29th. Fireside Inn & Suites, Riverside Street, Portland. That's experiencerspeak.yolasite.com.
Okay, we're back, and if you're listening live, feel free to jump over to podcastufo.com and jump in the chat room there. It's real easy sign up. And the phone number for call-ins, 603-967-4030. Nick Redfern, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, always. And I think you've been on a couple of times before in the past. And
yeah, I think 2 or 3, is it maybe? Something like that.
Right. And my God, you write a lot of books. how many books do you write a year, Nick?
Well, I guess in a 12-month period, probably about 2.5, something like that.
Which is a lot. And well, for anyone who's, just from what I hear, for people who have written books, they just say there's so much involved. And I know you do a lot of research, and that must be, take up a lot of the time.
Well, to be honest, yeah, I mean, the research is probably the main part, and then the writing, when you've got all the information, the writing doesn't take too long. I mean, I like to sort of work regular hours. I like to do 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. I don't like working at night or weekends. And, of course, if you're working 8 to 5, Monday to Friday, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, you can get a lot done in that period. And so if you've got 4 or 5 months to write the book, or say 4 months, and you've got the bulk of your research done, it actually works out well. You just got to kind of structure yourself, and you just got to get down to getting it done.
I have a friend that's been self-employed forever, and he does very, very well at what he does, and it's just the discipline. He does, he has this beautiful cottage on a lake with sandy shore, and he only goes there on the weekend. He gets up every morning, goes to work, makes a complete day by himself, working hard all day long. That's all he does. I mean, I really congratulate anyone that has that type of discipline. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you quickly get like a wake-up call that if you don't do that, it don't take long before, you get backed up and behind on things, and then the deadlines creep up on you. So, you really got to think about that, and like any sort of a self-employed job, project ahead as well. I don't want people to think it's just a job. For me, it's a passion as well.
Oh, yeah.
But even so, if you're writing and, you're with a publisher and they contractually give you a date to finish it by, you've got to finish it by then, whatever happens.
And so I was just going to ask you that, if they actually give you a deadline when to complete it. Now, do they edit the book afterwards? How does that, once you give them a manuscript, you hand it in, how long does it take before it actually hits the book stand?
Well, that's a good question, because it depends really on what books they might have coming round about the same time. For example, some publishers are quite relaxed and they just say, hey, just get it to us when you get it done, and they don't give you a cut-off time because they might have 5 or 6 other books they're working on. So, in other words, it's not like there's going to be a gap in their publications anyway. Now, say, for example, like with the Bloodline of the Gods book, which is out now. I mean, if they were putting out another sort of ancient astronaut book next month, they might well have said to me, hold off until December, because they wouldn't want to perhaps put out 2 books on the same subject, pretty much, within the same month. They try and stagger them. So, it depends on circumstances, what else they're publishing, how many more books they've got coming out that month. But I mean, New Page, they prefer to have like a structured timeline of when you're going to submit it. But like most publishers, when you submit the Word document, the amount of editing that goes on is really dependent on, what you put into the original Word document. For the most part, of all the books I've done, it's just been a case of, asking a few questions. What does this mean? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What's the source of this, if I've forgotten to add one particular reference to the bibliography? In other words, it's nothing, it's not rocket science, it's just the sort of things you would expect that they might want to sort of have a question about or alter. But I mean, I've never sort of been in a position of large-scale editing, where it comes back unrecognizable or anything like that at all. It's just literally words here and there, not even paragraphs or chapters,
Yeah, well, that's good. Well, so I do want to talk about Bloodline of the Gods, and then later on we can talk about some of your other books. But for the and also in the hour two, I'd like to talk about your book. I've always had a fascination with the Men in Black. I'd like to talk about that. So before we get started, though, on this particular book, just for the person that has not heard you before, most people have, but just for the person who hasn't, because since you've last been on the show, we have a lot of new listeners. So could you just give your background and what got you fascinated in the topic? I know that cryptozoology is a big thing of yours, kind of ahead of UFOs, if I remember, as far as being a passion of yours. That's what I remember from our podcast before. But go ahead if you would give a background.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. Well, what got me interested, when I was a kid, probably about 6, my parents took me on a week's holiday to Scotland, and we spent a day at Loch Ness, and I still got a few fragments of memories of my dad telling me the story of the Loch Ness Monster. And when you're that kind of age, I guess you think of things like the Loch Ness Monster along the lines of, monsters under the bed or in the closet, it's just sort of a creepy story. But then as I got to sort of 12, 13, I picked up a few UFO books and things like John Keel, Brad Steiger, that kind of thing, and got into it more. Then when I left school in England, school leaving age in England is actually like 16 upwards. You don't. It's quite different to over here. You can leave school at 16 and just do what you want. And I actually wasn't that good of a student. I was sort of pretty bad, really. I was one of those who wanted to sit around doing nothing, unfortunately. But that was partly because I just wasn't a good student. I was like a late starter. And so I suddenly went from being, a kid at school to in the big wide world. And I was like, well, what are you going to do? And I just didn't have an idea, and actually looked around jobs that were being advertised in the town I was living in at the time. And just through pure luck, there was a new company that had been established in the same town, and they were looking to set up a new magazine called Zero, which would be for sort of teenagers, people in their 20s, and it would be fashion, Hollywood, celebrity stuff, gossip, interviews with TV people, rock stars, that kind of thing. And, it sounded cool. It didn't sound like a real job. It didn't sound like I've got to be stuck working in a bank all day in a boring old suit and having some guy telling me what to do, And so I took the interview and got the job, and they sort of trained me upwards from the basics of how to interview people, structuring articles, how to begin an article so it attracts the reader's attention, and pretty much everything I needed to know about getting into the writing business. And the job lasted a couple of years, and then I did writing freelance for a while, because this was when Britain was going through a recession at the time, and jobs were hard to come by. So I did a bunch of other jobs for a few years, but always did writing, on the background as well. And then when I was in my sort of mid-20s, I thought, well, it's like a now or never time. Sort of closer you get to 30, I think sometimes people feel it's too late to change things, and I didn't want to be in that position. So I just took a chance and I quit the job, and I was like, well, either you make it or you don't, but I'm going to do the best to work full-time as a writer. It was like being pushed in the swimming pool at the deep end. You either swim or you drown. And so I sort of learned, about the industry, the best people to contact, book publishers, magazines, newspapers, and then really sort of, you got to learn to basically be aggressive and pitch yourself and promote yourself and sell yourself. And the only way you can really do that is by coming up with marketable new stories and things that the magazines and the publishers are going to want to buy. So that's what really got me involved, and that was like 20 years ago, and I've done it ever since. But I do, like a lot of freelance writers, which is a very precarious job. You know, I think a lot of people assume that if you write UFO books, even one, you know, you're living in the Hollywood Hills and driving a Ferrari, which actually I can assure you is not the case. But it is like, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you can do a job that you really enjoy, that's a bonus. But freelance writing is a precarious job, and you need your wits about you. You need to project ahead months and stay on top of things. But if you can do that and you enjoy it, you know, you get the rewards from doing something that gives you satisfaction as well.
Yes. No, I agree with a lot of that. And, you know, I heard a saying, you know, success is loving what you have to do. And I really, you know, I really promote anyone that is trying to get to do their, you know, trying to do their passion, whatever it is, and you know, sometimes the money comes along, you know, and usually it does if you're really, really into it. That's how I feel anyway.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, you know, I earn a living from the subject, but I mean, people might find it interesting, you know, if they want to get into this field, that probably only about 30% of my income does come from the book writing. The rest just comes from mainstream journalism, newspaper, magazine work, and I also do editing and proofreading services for other authors as well, and often on, you know, just subjects having nothing to do with the paranormal at all. And so, you know, it's sort of a combination. It's a job in writing, but it's a combination of widely sort of varying different subjects.
Yeah. I think there is, I've talked about it a number of times on this show, that there is a little bit of a misconception that, you know, people think just because you see someone like yourself. I've seen you on many documentaries on the History Channel, and, you know, you're all over the screen. You're not exactly getting rich from that either.
Well, no, I mean, most TV shows, you know, they have a set fee, which isn't a bad fee, but, you know, you may only do the show once a year, you know, that kind of thing, and you do somebody else's show a year. And again, you know, I mean, I enjoy doing them because sometimes you get to travel to on-location shoots, places you've never been before, so it's sort of like a cool road trip experience as well as doing the TV show, which I enjoy, you know. But yeah, I mean, for me, so I do a lot of work in the music industry as well, and I kind of draw an analogy between people who write books and bands. You know, it's like if you're busy as a band, you can earn a living on the road because today, you know, with downloads, CDs don't sell as much as they used to, you know, so bands have to earn another way. And if you're busy and you keep on top of things, you can earn a living. But it's only, you know, a few bands that actually kind of reach the position of, just major sellouts, etc. You know what I mean? It's that sort of most bands kind of go along at a certain level. Then every so often you'll find one that sort of shoots up to number one, and they're gigantic, and they maintain that for years until it's time for them to get off. You know. Yeah. And I kind of sort of equate that with writing. It's an unpredictable business, but for me, I enjoy the unpredictable aspect of it because you never really know what might happen and what can happen, and the doors it can open. So I would always say to people, if they, you know, I always say to people, I think everybody has got a story in them, a book, or, you know, there's always something that happens in somebody's life that would lend itself to a book. And people say, well, how do you start it? I said, well, you know, you just write it down as it happened and go back and look at it the next day, and you often think then, oh, I'll change that. It would look better if I did this. And it's, you know, like I said, you don't have to be Einstein. I mean, I'm a good example. I mean, I could tell you I went to college, university, got all these big degrees. I didn't. I walked out of school at 16, and what are you going to do? You know, you do what you're going to do. So anybody can do it, you know. That's right.
Well, that's, yeah. I wouldn't say anybody, but I think, you know, I don't think education always means. Now, I may be insulting someone that, you know, really went to a lot of
Well,
schooling, but education doesn't always mean that someone is really successful at something. You know, I know someone that made it to the 9th grade, and you know, he sold his company recently for $240 million. So that's not too bad.
Well, you know, actually, you make a good point there because, I mean, you know, I'm not saying education isn't important because it is, but I mean, I've run across people who've gone from school to college to university, and they become teachers and they go back to school, and they haven't really seen much of the big wide world. You know, as I said, I left school at 16, and I was sort of on the road interviewing bands at 17 backstage. You know, I was thrust into the big wide world quickly, and I enjoyed it. You know, and I was sort of traveling around here, there, and everywhere. You know, you get expenses given to you. You know, well, you got to book your flight and all this business. And you know, to do that at 16, you know, it's like jumping into something new. But for me, it was good because you don't just learn about, you know, taking your own responsibility, but you also learn quickly that what the big world's like. And sometimes I think when people are encased in just, you know, going from school to university and then straight into a job and not seeing the world around them, you know, it's kind of living in almost like a glass house. You don't see what's going on outside, or you don't experience it. And that's one of the good things about writing and things like this. You do get to sort of diversify and, you know, experience this and see that.
And how did you end up in the U.S.?
Well, actually, I got a job offer. I've lived in the U.S. for about 15 years, and actually got a job offer. As I said, I do contract research for authors, and it was basically like that. It was a 1-year contract, and then rolled over into a 3-year one. And a lot of it was based around the Dallas area where I moved to, and as I said, I've been here 15 years, and, you know, I like it over here, and did all the legal stuff, and, you know, officially emigrated, just in case Donald Trump's listening. And, you know, did all that paperwork, which, you know, for me, I think it's the right thing to do. If you're going to come to somebody else's country and live, you know, you abide by their regulations, and yeah, you know, I like it over here. I live in the Dallas area still, and we're just outside Dallas. And so basically that's what brought me over. And like I said, that was about 15 years ago.
Okay, so let's talk about your book. Before we start, Matthew, I'm not sure where he is. He's in the chat room every single time. He has been for several months, and he is always asking this question about the Rh negative factor. So hopefully he'll catch the podcast if he's not available on this, because I knew if he was going to be in the chat room, he'd have a million questions for you. So the book is, the short title to it is Bloodline of the Gods. And I'm trying to read, what is the tagline is Unravel the Mystery of the Human Blood Type to Reveal the Aliens Among Us.
Yeah, so, new page. Enjoy having like long subtitles.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how did you get interested in this topic? And it is such a, it's kind of a topic you wouldn't normally think about. And the only reason I have thought about it at all is because, again, from this guy named Matthew that's in the chat room, he's always talking about it. He has a great interest in the connections of abductees as well. So, let's hear about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. It is kind of an obscure subject, and for the most part, in terms of the UFO research field, it has sort of gone under the radar for a long time. Now, you know, if you Google Rh negative blood, you can find a lot of just regular medicine-based stories, you know, at hospital sites, doctors, medical sites, that kind of thing, which will give you a lot of just straightforward background on the Rh negative situation. And occasionally, you know, you'll drop on one that relates to the UFO subject. Now, one of the things I always look for when I'm writing a book, you know, if people are going to buy your book, you want to be able to give them value for money and give them something new. I mean, I could tell you some horror stories about some well-known authors who just have total disregard for their audiences, and I've almost come to fist fights with a couple of them. I mean, literally, because they're like, well, they'll buy my books because it's my name. It doesn't really matter. Oh. To me, that's wrong. You've got to show your audience respect because they're the people buying your books. The only reason I'm able to do what I do is because, I'm fortunate enough for people. They buy the books, and I appreciate the fact that they do, and I want to be able to give something back, whether it's hanging out, over a beer at a conference, or, at a lecture, or just by, signing an autograph or whatever. And so that comes back to the issue of when I'm looking for a new book, you want to give the person a set value for money and could try and come up with something new rather than regurgitating old stuff. And so I was looking around for ideas that were sort of a little bit untouched, but were known to a degree at least. And one of the things that popped up was the whole issue of, Rh negative blood. And to a degree, I stumbled upon it sort of by accident from the perspective of hearing a few stories, like online, or seeing stories online, or, listening to them at conferences, where a few people said, I got Rh negative blood and ABC, etc., etc. And then I realized that, well, that's another person who's Rh negative and another. So literally one day I just Googled Rh negative blood plus UFO. It was that simple, and found a few leads here and there, researched it further, and then started putting the word out a little bit and interviewing more people and more people. And I realized that it was actually not just a minor, obscure aspect. It was actually a large aspect, and is a large aspect of the subject, but very few people have been talking about it. It's kind of like the whole issue, like the elephant in the room, It's there in front of us, but it hardly ever gets touched upon. And then I thought, well, it's time to do something about that and sort of readdress the situation, and that's what prompted me to do it.
And so let's talk about, well, first of all, there's a question that someone sent me an email today, and they had a question they wanted me to ask you, and that is it possible for Rh positive parents to give birth to an Rh negative child?
Yes, it actually is. I actually know someone who falls into that category. There are risks with having an Rh negative parent, excuse me, and an Rh positive parent, and I'll explain why that is. If you have, say, an Rh negative father and Rh positive mother, when the fetus starts to grow, there can actually be no problems at all. Now, a lot of people don't realize that although, the unborn baby actually gets its nourishment from the mother's bloodstream and the bloodstream of the fetus, they don't cross, they don't mix, they're actually kept separate. However, if there are sort of few concerns about the fetus and, they have this procedure where a needle is inserted to allow them to take blood from the fetus to check it all out, if during that process a little bit of that blood gets into the mother's bloodstream, what's very weird is that the Rh positive mother, her entire body recognizes the negative blood as being foreign and essentially alien and deadly, and the mother's body literally tries to kill the unborn fetus.
Right.
And that can be extremely dangerous, to the point where, fortunately today, we have drugs that will combat that. But in the past, the baby would be at major risk. At the very least, it can cause severe anemia because the mother's body actually prevents the baby from absorbing all the nourishment. And so they become like the equivalent of like a young anorexic girl who doesn't eat, but they're not eating deliberately. It's the mother's body trying to shut down the fetus. So in other words, that is one of the strangest things about being Rh negative versus positive, is that the Rh negative baby is viewed as alien, no pun intended.
Now, so getting back to that question, so if two Rh positive parents can give birth to an Rh negative, how does that fit in with your theories in this book?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because, the whole issue of Rh negative parents versus, an Rh negative baby, it demonstrates that sometimes, this can happen at random. But the reason why I wrote the book is because when you study the Rh negative phenomenon overall, we find a higher percentage of Rh negatives who are either abductees, contactees, or have had profound UFO experiences. So, in other words, even if some of these events appear to occur at random, there are unanswered questions as to why that might happen. But even if that does happen, we still see, sort of like a greater level of people who are into this subject. And so that's what leads me to believe that being Rh negative is not just a matter of, being different to an Rh positive person. There's something else going on, even at a mindset level where the people feel driven and drawn to this subject.
Wow, okay. So if you're listening live, you can jump into the chat room at podcastufo.com and ask a question, or you can call in at 603-967-4030. A lot of people are listening right now, Nick, but we get very few calls, so just letting you know. But
oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Now, can you kind of explain the book in general, and and go over some of the bullet points of the book as far as the connection of possible aliens?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Well, just so as people understand, because it'll sort of lead into it, help them understand the nature of it. If I just give you a quick rundown on what Rh negative blood actually is and what it means. Now, somewhere in the region of sort of 85 to about 90% of the population is Rh positive. So it's about sort of 10 to 12% that is Rh negative. Now, Rh stands for rhesus, as in the rhesus monkey. And essentially, an Rh positive person, there are 4 types of blood, AB, and O. And those classifications come from what are called the antigens of a person's blood cells. And antigens are proteins that are found on the surface of cells to combat bacteria and viruses. Now, those antigens, those proteins, if you have those, you're Rh positive. The Rh negatives don't possess any of those proteins that the rest of us have. So this begs the question, if the theory of evolution is 100% correct, why is it that a small percentage of the population has such radically different blood to the others? And why should they have this UFO connection to a greater degree, percentage-wise, than the rest of the population? So that's when we have to sort of try and figure out why that should be. And this gets to what you said about the theme and the bullet points. One of the things I point out is that although 10 to 15% of the population's Rh negative, there's actually one group of people where it rises from anywhere between about 45 and 55%, and that's what's called the Basque people of Spain, B-A-S-Q-U-E. And as I said, their figures are like 45 to 55%. Well, the Basque people have a unique language which is not totally unknown anywhere else in Europe. It's so weird and strange. It doesn't resemble any other European language. And it's been suspected that it's like a modern-day equivalent of a very ancient language. One of the theories is that it's actually the language of Cro-Magnon man, because superficially at least, the Basques are probably the closest living relative to the Cro-Magnons. They resemble them in certain ways. They have like a larger forehead, more prominence. Their bodies are more bulky. And the areas where the Basques are prominent are also the areas where Cro-Magnon man proliferated. Now, there are other areas of the planet where there are Cro-Magnons, and there's a higher percentage of Rh negatives in those areas, in the same way where the Basques live in France and Spain. There's a higher percentage of Rh negatives there, and Cro-Magnon man live there, which is almost like a solid indicator that Cro-Magnon man was also Rh negative. And this then leads into the issue of why Cro-Magnon man should have been Rh negative and possibly not the Neanderthals or some of the other types of human. And from there, that leads into the theories postulated by various people who studied the ancient aliens angle, that was Cro-Magnon man genetically manipulated in the distant past, possibly to be some sort of slave species? And if it was it modified to be sort of more of a robust worker-type entity? And did that involve making it Rh negative? Because there are indications that Rh negatives have a greater resistance to certain viruses and diseases. They have slightly lower blood pressure, which is good. You know, if your blood pressure is slightly lower than normal, that's actually good for your heart and everything. So in other words, it's the issue of, was somebody in the distant past trying to refine an early human species, and as a result, did they create some sort of Rh negative entity, if you like?
Wow. Now, so you're saying that there's maybe 12% of the U.S. population, and so what is the connection to UFOs? I mean, I would think that if someone's filling out a UFO report, for one, that blood type is nothing that they would, indicate. But so how would you do some research as far as this goes?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it stems from the fact that, the more the story gets out there, the more people come forward and say, hey, I'm Rh negative. And the percentage who come forward demonstrates, I mean, it's not like it's the majority of the population who get abducted, it's not the majority of the human population get abducted in the first place, but when we find a larger percentage are Rh negative, people who read about this because they want to learn more about their experiences, they then realize that, hey, I'm not alone, there are other Rh negatives. So in other words, a lot of this comes through word of mouth and people relating their stories, and there's clearly, a larger percentage. Now, one of the intriguing things that demonstrates a link between abductions and the Rh negative issue is that many of the Rh negatives, certainly a higher percentage than average, are born with an extra vertebra in their back. Now, that can happen at random. It's actually not, that uncommon an anomaly, and most people may not even know unless they have to have back surgery. But the percentage is higher in Rh negatives. Now, what's really interesting, keeping that in mind, is if we go back to probably the most famous alien abduction story of all, the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961. Well, when the Hills had their encounter, obviously there was no real talk at that time of alien abductions, but they recalled missing time, being taken on board some sort of craft, started to get nightmares and bad dreams, and realized that something weird had happened in that missing time. So they decided to go and undergo regressive hypnosis. Now, keep in mind this issue of the extra vertebra in the Rh negatives. Well, Barney Hill, when he was under hypnosis, said that when he was on board this craft, the presumed aliens did something very weird. He said they were running their fingers down his spine slowly and carefully, and it made him wonder if they were counting his vertebra, which, bear in mind, nobody was talking about extra vertebra and aliens and Rh negative blood and abductions in 1961. And yet it was in the immediate aftermath of 61 that Barney was talking about all this. So, that's one of the first things. I've also got a chapter in the book about what are known as MILABs, sort of military abductions, where abductees who have been abducted by, again, presumed extraterrestrials have later been abducted by what sounds almost like rogue military agencies, like shadow agencies, and asked a lot of questions about their blood. What type of blood do you have? Things like this, suggesting that somebody at an official level, or, as I said, at a rogue level outside of the government, seems to know something about this, and they're targeting abductees as well.
Wow. Yeah. So as far as people that are abducted, I know Denise Stoner and Kathy Martin, the niece of Betty Hill, have a questionnaire for the similarities between abduction cases, and I'm not sure if the blood type is in that, but I'm going to see Kathy next week I'm going to ask her about that and ask her what her thoughts are on that subject. Did you speak to anyone like her that does any abduction research?
Yeah, actually did. I mean, a classic example and right up to date is Mike Cleland. I don't know if you know Mike, but Cleland. Mike Cleland. He's done a huge amount of research into abductions, and particularly from the perspective of how a lot of abductees have said that they seem to have scream memories of seeing owls. That's to say, they know something weird's happened, but they can't consciously recall the abduction experience, but they have this sort of weird memory of seeing like a large owl stood at the side of the road.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Mike has hypothesized the idea that, he's actually got a book coming out on it shortly, hypothesized that these could be screen memories created by extraterrestrials to give like a down-to-earth explanation to hide what really happened. Now, bear in mind, Mike has dug deeply into these phenomena and had experienced a lot of weird synchronicities as well when he's been doing this research. And so not long ago, he decided to get his blood checked, and it turns out he's Rh negative as well. And so, here's a guy who's at the forefront of research into abductions, looking into some really interesting alternative issues like the owl camouflage angle, and he suddenly finds out he's Rh negative. Other examples, one of the chapters I have in the book is on a controversial issue known as inherited memory. It's like if you're a child or and you look at your parents, you can see traits from your father and your mother in you. Same with brothers and sisters and things like that. Well, there's another theory that, to a degree, and encoded deep in our DNA and our subconscious, that fragments of actual memories can be passed down as well. Now, that's not been proved, of course, but what's interesting, as I point out in this particular chapter in the book, I mentioned about how certain people who are Rh negative feel driven to the UFO subject, but they don't know why. Again, it is like something's encoded in their mind. And I don't think for that reason that it's coincidence that several of the major figures within ancient astronaut research are Rh negative. For example, Eric von Daniken is Rh negative. He's sort of, the leading or the most well-known ancient astronaut author. Granted, there were authors before him like Raymond Drake and Maurice Jessup who wrote about ancient aliens, but certainly Chariots of the Gods, written by von Daniken in 1968, was the one that really brought it to the world. So he's Rh negative. Brad Steiger, who's written extensively on ancient mysteries, Atlantis, the pyramids, ancient astronauts, he's Rh negative. Robert Anton Wilson, who's now deceased, but in the 70s, he believed he was having sort of contactee channeling conversations with extraterrestrials, some of which were based around ancient mysteries connected with the Egyptians. That's just 3 examples of a number where people at the forefront of looking into ancient mysteries just happen to be Rh negative.
Wow. And being such a small percentage, that does mean something. Is it just the absence of a particular antigen that makes Rh negative?
Well, yeah, pretty much, yes. But it's not so much, what they lack that defines them as Rh negative. That is the reason, that they're called Rh negative. But it's the sort of the profound differences that just that one issue seems to provoke. As I said, a higher resistance to viruses. There are other weird issues as well, like less tolerance to sunlight, direct sunlight. For some reason, I've spoken to a lot of Rh negative people, some of whom have no involvement in the UFO subject, and exposure to sunlight. A lot of them complain rashes and hives on the shoulders and neck, particularly, more than anywhere else. And as I said, there's this issue of slightly lower than normal blood pressure. Many of them feel driven towards sort of spiritual issues, not sort of necessarily organized religion, but just the idea of, focusing on something bigger out there. And as I said, the main thing is the UFO issue and the spillover there with abductions as well. So in other words, to get back to your point, yes, it's the whole issue of the lack of this protein that defines them. But the weird thing is why then that should cause all these other spin-offs to occur as well.
Right, right. When you were doing your research, if you haven't already talked about it, was there one thing in particular that really stood out as really fascinating to you?
Well, I think the one thing for me, and this sort of lends itself to further research, is how, you know, the abduction phenomenon, which I think is connected to all this because, you know, you have the whole genetics angle, is the way in which the abduction phenomenon has sort of developed.
Hang on just a minute. Sorry, Nick. We have a caller who just called in. Caller, please say your name and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Martin. It's Matthew. I had to work late tonight, so I was via phone.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was talking about you earlier because I thought you'd have a bunch of questions for Nick, and you're on with Nick now, so go ahead and ask away.
Sure. I want to make a general comment. I posted in the chat room a few weeks back. For those of you who are interested in knowing your blood type, I was surprised when I asked my doctor, who does blood work on me all the time, who declined to tell me what my blood type is, stating they didn't know, and saying insurance wouldn't pay for it, and it would cost me $100 to find that. But the alternate way is donate your blood, and they have to tell you. So
okay.
That's how I found out I am O negative.
Well, actually, you know, that's interesting that you're interested in all this subject and you're O negative. O negative, I'm sure you know, is known as the universal donor because you know, if you're A group or B group or AB, you have to have that sort of blood injected into you, you know, to be okay. However, anybody can be injected with O negative because, as I said, it's called the universal donor. And so, in that sense, you know, you've got a really unique type of blood coupled with an interest in UFO phenomena.
Have you studied the research where they claim that Rh negative cannot be cloned at all?
No, I actually haven't, no.
Okay. And then I just have a couple other commonalities that I found from my research in Rh negative. I have low body temperature. My core temperature is typically 96.8 to 97.3. I'm very sensitive to heat. I sweat profusely from my head. And another thing is I get startled very easily. People like walk around a corner, I'll just get really, really taken back. I'm easy to startle, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I don't know if you heard the show earlier, but I was actually talking about the lack of sensitivity, or oversensitivity, excuse me, to sunlight, and also low blood pressure, and that actually ties in as well with like low body temperature and a lower than normal pulse rate, which actually is nothing to sort of worry about. It's a good sign for the most part, providing you don't have any underlying conditions. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting you've called in and you actually demonstrated you've got some of those characteristics.
So, Matthew, we met actually out in Phoenix originally, but you've been posting something in the chat room about Rh negative blood almost anytime the abduction comes up or anything like that. So how, what got you interested in that, and you must have done some research on that.
Well, it is part of, you were talking momentarily about Kathleen Martin. On her commonality list, it's listed there, and it just comes up again and again. So it was just a synchronicity with me, and I was trying to discover why I sweat so much, and I did a lot of research, and that's what led me to look into myself.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. You know, we're getting right up to the top of the hour. So thanks for calling in, Matthew, and we'll see you back in the chat room.
You bet. Bye.
Bye. So we're still on, aren't you, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I've had some trouble before with this phone system. It's all through Skype. But anyway, we're right at the top of the hour, so next hour we're going to talk about Men in Black and some of your other books. So that's it for our hour show. If you'd like to listen to the second hour, it's actually very fascinating. We really get into the Men in Black topic. So to listen to the full show, all you have to do is support us for $1 a month or more. That information's right on our website, podcastufo.com. It's real easy to sign up, and you can play the media. It automatically goes into your iPhone as a podcast or any other type of media player. You get your own special link. You only have to set it up one time, and it's pretty smooth. They got it smoothed out pretty well these days. So next week we have Don Ecker on, and I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show today. Alejandro Rojas with the news. Our guest, Nick Redfern. Peggy Shunning for helping us with the Facebook page. Remember, you can like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO news. We have music by Bruce Renier and Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse. So that's it, and we'll see you next week. Remember to keep your eyes to the sky.